Roland Price did not look up when she came into the room. He was 3 signatures deep in a land transfer package that would fold 4 downtown parcels into a single tower footprint. And his pen moved across each page the way it had moved across every page for 30 years, without hesitation, without ceremony. The office took up a corner of the 51st floor, glass on 2 sides, the lake gray and enormous below, the rest of the city arranged beneath him like something he had personally decided to allow. People came into this room and stood a little straighter. That was the point of the room. She stood a few feet from the desk with her hands loose at her sides, waiting, not fidgeting. He finished a page, flipped it, finished another. When he finally lifted his eyes, he saw a woman somewhere in her mid-30s, plainly dressed, a charcoal blazer with no logo and no shine to it, the kind of clothing a person chooses on purpose rather than to be seen. Her expression gave him nothing. He was used to reading people in the first second, and in the first second she gave him nothing at all. "You come recommended," he said, which was not a compliment and was not meant as one. "Recommendations don't mean much to me, results do. If you slow my people down, you won't be here in a month." "I won't slow anyone down," she said. "Not I'll do my best. Not thank you for the opportunity, just that." He held her eyes half a beat longer than he meant to, then went back to the document and did not think about it again for a while. What Roland Price did not know, could not have known, sitting in his cold glass room with $1 billion of Toronto real estate, churning quietly beneath his signature, was that the consultant standing on the other side of his desk was the daughter he had refused to claim 34 years earlier, the child whose existence he had once stood in a lawyer's office and denied under his breath. The life he had decided, very deliberately and very completely, not to look at. Her name on the contract she'd signed was Simone Auclair. Auclair was her mother's name, and before that her grandfather's, the man who had driven 8 hours from Rimouski, when Simone's mother was 6 months pregnant and abandoned, and who had never once, in all the years after, made her feel that she'd cost him anything. Price was on the birth certificate too, in a smaller way, in a box her mother had refused to leave blank out of some stubbornness. Simone hadn't understood until she was much older. But Auclair was the name she'd been raised under, and she wore it the way she wore the plain blazer, on purpose. 7 months before that morning, Simone had been sitting at a kitchen table in a narrow flat in Verdun, a laptop open, a spiral notebook filling up beside it in her small, exact handwriting. She had been reading about Price Group for the better part of a year. Not with obsession, with method. The way she did everything, quietly, all the way to the bottom, without telling anyone she was doing it. Her mother came in from her shift at the clinic with her coat still on and stopped in the doorway when she saw the screen. "There's a consulting post," Simone said, not looking up. "Cost and feasibility, contract work. It closes Friday." Marguerite Auclair set her bag down on the chair very carefully, the way you set down something when your hands want to do something else. "No, Maimon." I said no. Her voice stayed even. Her mother's voice almost always stayed even. It was the thing under the voice that moved. She had spent 34 years building a wall, brick by brick, between her daughter and that name, that skyline, that man, and she had not done it out of hatred. She'd done it the way you build a seawall, because the water is real and it does not care about you. Simone finally looked up. "I'm not doing it to get anything from him. I'm not doing it for money, and I'm not doing it to blow up his life." "Then what?" Marguerite said. It wasn't quite a question. Simone was quiet for a moment. "I want to see who he actually is, and then I want to decide myself whether he's a person worth forgiving. I've spent my whole life letting you decide that for me. I need to look at him with my own eyes." Her mother sat down across from her, still in her coat, and for a long time she didn't say anything. When she did, her voice had dropped to something Simone rarely heard from her. "He stood up in a room full of people I respected," she said, "and he told them I was a liar, that I'd planned it, that I was a girl from Verdun who'd found a rich man and seen an opening. He made sure the people who mattered to him never had to wonder about it. And then he went on with his life like I was a bad quarter he'd written off." She stopped. "I survived that. I built something out of nothing. But now you want to walk into his building and stand in front of him, and you want me to be fine with it." "I want you to trust me," Simone said. "Not him."
Me.
Marguerite didn't answer that night. But on Friday she didn't take the laptop away either, and she didn't say a word when Simone hit submit. There were 3 consulting slots and something like 400 applicants. Simone's interview ran 50 minutes past its scheduled window, and not because she was pushing. Every answer she gave made the panel want to ask another question. She knew where Price Group was overexposed better than 2 of the vice presidents sitting across from her. She'd traced the leverage on their 2 Calgary towers back through a financing structure that even their own people had stopped looking at closely, and she talked about it plainly, without the little theater most consultants performed to sound expensive. When they asked how she'd come to know all that, she said she read a lot and left it there. They offered her the contract 11 days later. Marguerite took the news standing at the stove. She didn't turn around. She stirred something that didn't need stirring, and after a while she pressed both palms flat against the counter and breathed, in and out, the way she did, and that was all. Roland's first real look at Simone came on her 9th day. There was a meeting he wasn't supposed to be interested in, a stalled acquisition of a mid-sized property manager up in Barrie. A contract dispute with a remediation firm over a contaminated parcel that Price Group needed cleaned before a residential rezoning could go through. The thing had been dragging for 6 weeks. Every week it dragged cost the project close to $60,000 in carrying and delay, and the room had been circling the same drain for over an hour. Simone was there to model the numbers and take notes. She set her pen down. The dispute isn't really about the cleanup scope, she said, quietly enough that the room had to settle to hear her. It's about who eats the risk if the soil comes back worse than the surveys say. Right now the remediation firm carries all of it and gets nothing for finishing early, so they've got every reason to stall and retest and cover themselves. Split the contingency. Give them a share of the upside if the parcel clears clean and on time. The dispute solves itself, because you've stopped asking them to gamble with only their own chips. There was a silence. Then a director named Devin Marsh, who had been fighting the file for a month and a half, sat back and said, "She's right." Roland looked at her from the far end of the table. She had already picked her pen back up and gone back to her notes, as if the sentence she'd just said hadn't cost her anything, as if she hadn't noticed it land. When the room cleared, he stopped at the door. "How long have you been on contract here?" 9 days, she said. He didn't answer, but he didn't forget it either. The weeks after that had a certain rhythm. Simone never reached for attention. She asked narrow, careful questions and finished everything before it was due, and had a way of finding the one detail in a noisy room that everybody else had walked past without seeing. Roland started asking for her by name on the files that mattered to him. Not warmly, not personally, but with the flat efficiency of a man who has recognized a tool that works and intends to use it. That much he could explain to himself. What he couldn't explain was the rest of it. The way she tilted her head a few degrees when she was turning a problem over, chin dropping, eyes going middle distance. The half second she took before answering something hard. Not because she was unsure, but because she was choosing. The way she drifted to the window when she was thinking, hands in her jacket pockets, looking out at the lake instead of down at her phone. He knew those things. He had never once sat down and made a list of them. But he knew them. The way you know the shape of a room you grew up in without having to look, the way your hand finds a light switch in the dark. He didn't examine it. He filed it somewhere behind the acquisition and the tower and the endless machinery of his days. And he kept moving, but it was there now, like a knock in the wall, soft and steady, coming from a room he was sure he'd sealed off years ago. She felt it too, in her own way, though she'd have described it differently. She hadn't come expecting to be moved by him. She'd come expecting a villain, because a villain would have been simple, and she'd built a clean, hard picture of him over the years. A man who chose money and image over a woman and a child, and never lost a night's sleep. Standing in his meetings, watching him work, that picture held for a while. He was cold. He was exact. He treated uncertainty like a personal insult and read every room for leverage before he opened his mouth. All of it fit. And then, on a Thursday evening in her 3rd week, it stopped fitting quite so well. She'd gone back to the 51st floor to collect a binder she'd left in the small conference room, later than she'd meant to. The cleaning crew already moving down the far hall, and through the glass of Roland's office she saw him at his desk with the door open, not working. He was sitting with a photograph in his hands, a real one, printed, its edges gone soft the way paper goes soft, only when it's been held over and over rather than framed and forgotten. He wasn't looking at it so much as holding it. When he heard her footsteps he put it in a drawer without hurry, the way a man puts something away that he's put away 1,000 times. "Forgot my binder," Simone said. "Take it," Roland said, already back to his screen, and she took it and left. But she thought about the photograph for 2 days. The man who had told a pregnant woman she was a liar, who had dismantled her mother's name to keep his own clean, who had never in 3 decades made a single quiet phone call to find out whether the child was real. That same man sat alone at 7 in the evening holding a worn photograph as if it weighed something. It didn't redeem him. Nothing about it undid a single thing he'd done. But it complicated him, and complication was harder to carry than anger. Anger was clean. Anger didn't ask you to decide anything. Her mother saw the picture on a Tuesday. Not the photograph in the drawer, a different one. In a business feature about Price Group's 3rd quarter numbers. Buried on the site of one of the national papers. There was a wide shot from some ribbon cutting, Roland at the podium, and slightly behind him and to the left stood Simone, there in her capacity as staff, and she was standing exactly the way he was standing. Shoulders back, weight even, hands still, watching the room instead of the cameras. Marguerite stared at it for a long time. Then she closed the laptop and called her sister in Trois-Rivières. "She looks like him," she said when Celine picked up. There was a pause on the line. "Marguerite, She always has. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself nobody would ever put the two things side by side. Her voice didn't break, but it came near. But if I can see it in a photograph on a newspaper's website, Celine, then how long before he can see it standing across a table from him? Does she know what she's walking into? She thinks she does, Marguerite said. She's 35 and she's the smartest person I've ever known, and she has absolutely no idea what it can cost a person to open a door like that. 2 floors below the executive suite, Simone was learning things no interview had prepared her for. She'd seen Roland in meetings, decisive and glacial, a man who took a room apart for weak points before he committed to a sentence. But she'd started seeing the other versions too, in the gaps. The way he lingered a beat too long by the boardroom windows after everyone filed out. The way he never quite let a compliment land, deflecting it into the next problem before it could touch him. The way he sometimes went very still when a younger person on his staff said something clever, as if a clever answer from a young person cost him something private he wasn't willing to name. She kept a small, honest ledger in her head, the way she kept ledgers for everything. On one side, the things he'd done, which had not changed and would not change. On the other side, the man in front of her, who was smaller and stranger and more human than the villain she'd built, and who therefore could not simply be hated and filed away. She didn't yet know what to do with the ledger. She only knew it wasn't balancing the way she'd expected it to. And that both of them were getting closer to a thing neither of them had a word for. And that in a couple of weeks there wasn't going to be any more room to keep pretending they didn't feel it in the room together. The file surfaced on a Friday. Roland had been going through archived personnel and vendor records as part of a due diligence sweep tied to a refinancing. 6 years of documents his assistant, Priya Nair, had pulled and organized for him. Somewhere in the intake paperwork for the consulting contracts there was a background form, and on the background form there was a mother's maiden name, and a place of birth, and a date, and Roland Price, who had spent 30 years being the fastest reader of documents in every room he entered, stopped reading. He sat with the page for a long time. He did not call Priya. He did not call legal, which was the instinct that had saved him and damned him 34 years ago, the reflex to turn a person into a problem and a problem into a strategy. He just sat there while the lake went from gray to black outside the glass, and something in him that had been sealed a very long time made a sound. He asked Priya to have Simone come up on Monday morning, first thing, no agenda listed. Simone knew before she walked in. Priya's face was too careful and the message had no subject line, and Roland's door was closed, which it almost never was. She went in and stood where she always stood, a few feet from the desk, hands at her sides, calm. Roland looked at her for a long moment without speaking. In 30 years of running companies he had learned to read rooms, faces, the distance between what a person said and what they wanted. He didn't need any of that now. It was already there and had been for weeks, in the line of her jaw, in her eyes, in the specific quality of her stillness, which he'd been carrying around inside himself like a knock in the wall. "Is it true?" he said. It wasn't his boardroom voice. It was older than that, quieter, the voice of something that had been sitting in the dark waiting to be asked. Simone didn't look away. "You tell me," she said. The room held the weight of it. Roland stood slowly, like a man who's no longer certain his legs are his own, and crossed to the window, the same window she'd always drifted toward, and looked out at the harbor. When he turned back, something in his face had come loose, not shattered, nothing so dramatic, just open, the way a thing finally opens when it's been held shut so long that the effort of holding it costs more than the fear of what's behind it. "Your mother," he said. "Marguerite." "Yes," Simone said. In the silence that followed, 34 years of decisions hung between them, waiting to become something or nothing depending on what came next. Roland didn't move for a while. When he finally spoke, he chose his words the way a man chooses them when he's understood, maybe for the first time. That words have mass and can be dropped on people. "I told myself she was lying," he said. "I told myself she'd seen a chance and taken it. That it was a scheme." He paused, and his hand pressed flat against the cold glass, though he didn't seem to know it was doing that. "I needed to believe that. Because the other thing that could have been true was that I chose my name and my money over a person. Over a child. And I couldn't live in the same body as a man who'd done that, so I made her a liar instead. It was cheaper." Simone watched him. "Was it easier?" she asked. He turned. "What?" Believing she was lying, deciding she was the calculating one. Her voice wasn't cruel. It was the same clean precision she brought to a stalled contract turned now on this. "Was it easier that way?" Roland let out a long breath. "Yes." "Good," she said. "Then you already understand exactly what you did. You don't need me to explain it to you." There was no shouting in that room. Nobody threw an accusation like a chair. There were only 2 people in a glass office on the 51st floor, and the long, quiet weather that follows a decision made 34 years before when it finally reaches the far shore. Roland took a step toward her. "Simone, I didn't come here to punish you," she said, and her voice was steady but not cold. I want to be clear about that. I came because I needed to know whether you were a man I could understand. Not love, I'm not offering you that, and I don't know if I ever will. Just understand. And he asked. The question came out smaller than anything she'd heard him say. She took her time. She always took her time. You're more complicated than I wanted you to be, she said finally. That's not me forgiving you. That's not a kindness. It's just the truth, and I've decided I'd rather have the truth than the version of you I made up to keep myself angry. Marguerite arrived at the tower a little over an hour later. Simone had texted her 3 words. He found out. And Marguerite had stood in the lobby for a moment, with the loony bright winter light coming off the harbor through the glass. Adjusting the strap of her bag over and over, looking at the elevators the way you look at a road. You were sure you'd never have to drive again. Then she got in. When she came into the office, Roland was by the window. He turned when the door opened. They looked at each other across the length of the room. 2 people who had built 34 years of separate, careful lives out of the wreckage of one brutal season. And for a moment neither of them could find the first word. Marguerite, he said, and his voice caught on the second half of her name. She didn't cross the room, she didn't need to. He asked me not to stop him, she said. So I didn't. I want you to hear that from me. This was Simone's choice. Not mine. I would never have sent her to you. I spent her whole childhood making sure she'd never have to stand in a room like this. I know, Roland said. I know you did. She turned and looked at her daughter, standing quiet and still off to the side, that patience Simone had carried since she was a little girl. The stillness Marguerite had spent decades marveling at and half dreading, because she'd always known, even when she pretended not to, exactly where it came from. You have his eyes, she told Simone. Her own voice was very soft. I used to tell people you had mine. I told it to you too. I'm sorry for that. You have his eyes, you always did. Something crossed Simone's face that wasn't quite a smile and didn't need to be. Roland tried. That was the part the story had to hold on to, honestly. Because it would have been simpler and cleaner to say that he didn't. That a man like that stays a man like that. A villain who never changes is a comfortable thing. You can keep him at a distance and never have to feel anything but the clean, uncomplicated heat of being right about him. But Roland tried, and trying complicated everyone's arithmetic. He didn't do it with grand gestures. He didn't call a lawyer to draw up some instrument that would make him look generous. And he didn't write the kind of long, well-crafted apology that's secretly a monument to the person apologizing. He did it the way people do it when they know they have no standing to ask for anything back, quietly, at a cost to himself without expecting a return. He started calling Simone about things that weren't files. He sat through the excruciating silences on those calls without rushing to fill them with a performance. Because the performances were the thing that had cost him everything in the first place. He learned, slowly, badly, to say a thing and then just let it sit there without managing how it was received. He reached out to Marguerite once, and only once, and not to apologize in the language that helps the apologizer. He said, I know what I took from you. I know I can't give it back, and I'm not going to insult you by pretending I can. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to let me be less of a coward with whatever time is left. She didn't forgive him. Not in the clean, tidy way that stories sometimes seem to demand as a fee for ending. But she stopped carrying it the way she'd carried it for 34 years, tucked hard against her chest like something that might go off. She set it down, not for his sake, for her own. That turned out to be its own kind of freedom, and she was surprised, at 58, to discover she still had freedoms she hadn't spent. There were questions Simone never fully got answered, and she made a kind of peace with that too. There was the matter of the years, the ordinary years, the school concerts in church basements in Verdun, and the winters her grandfather had shoveled the walk because there was no one else to do it, and the times money had been so thin her mother had gone without so she wouldn't have to. None of that was recoverable. Roland couldn't buy it back and had the sense, finally, not to try. What he could do was be honest about the size of it, and there was a strange dignity in watching a man who had spent his life minimizing everything, learn to sit still in front of something he couldn't make smaller. 3 months after that Monday, Simone walked back into Price Group, and not as a contractor this time. She'd been offered a permanent role, a senior position in strategy and risk, competitive, earned entirely on the work, nothing about it a favor, and both of them careful to keep it that way. She'd taken 2 weeks to decide, the way she took 2 weeks to decide most things, weighing it in that private ledger of hers until the column settled. She hadn't taken it because he was her father. She'd been very clear with herself about that, sitting at the same kitchen table in Verdun, where the whole thing had started. Her mother pretending not to watch her from the doorway. She'd taken it because it was the best work in the country in her field, and because she'd decided she wasn't going to let the accident of who he was chase her out of a life she'd otherwise have wanted. Roland was in his office when she appeared in the doorway that first morning. Priya had already told him she'd accepted, but he looked up anyway, And something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite relief. Something older than either, the specific expression of a man who stopped deserving a thing a long time ago and is being handed it anyway and knows precisely the difference between deserving and being given. "You're early," he said. "I know," Simone said. She set her bag down on the chair across the desk, the same side of the desk she'd stood behind on that first morning when he hadn't bothered to look up. This time he looked up. "I'm not here because you're my father," she said. "I need that to stay true. If it stops being true, I'll leave and I won't make it a thing." "I understand," Roland said. "I'm not counting on it." "I'm here because you're actually trying," she said. "That's the whole reason. It's a smaller reason than you probably want it to be. It's more than I've got a right to," he said. She held his eyes for a second longer than she needed to, the way he'd once held hers on this very spot without either of them understanding why. "Then don't stop," she said. And she meant the trying, and they both knew it. She opened her laptop. He turned back to the pages on his desk. For a while the only sound in the room was the harbor far below, and the small, ordinary noise of two people beginning the slow, unglamorous work of figuring out what it means to start something this late, with this much between them. And no guarantee at all that it lands. He didn't get his daughter back. There was no version of the arithmetic where that was on offer, and he'd finally grown up enough to stop asking for it. He got something harder and more honest than that, and rarer. He got a second chance to become a man who might one day be worth the word she wasn't ready to give him. And this time, with the gray lake going on forever past the glass, and his daughter working quietly across the desk, he didn't look away.